see our 2 boxes sitting there, the big wooden crates. So we'll be bringing it back next week to set up. When we set up next week, we have something exciting happening. We're going to have Florida's Got the Blues and Jazz. In other words, Florida is a big area where blues and jazz started. I mean, it was just incredible how many blues artists and jazz artists made an impact here in Florida. And we'll be able to give you more information as soon as we uncard it and see what they have in there for us. And those of you that know, Joe Donato is going to be part of the Jazz It Up with Joe Donato Coffee and Conversation next month on August 17th at 7 p.m. The first half is his lecture that he knows all of these jazz greats from the last 60, 65 years. Apparently he's at 66, 67. No, he's about pushing 80, but he is just so active still. And the second half, because he says, I'm going to talk about it in the beginning, the second half is also going to be a free performance of doing his different interpretations of the music with a 2-piece band behind him. So all free, so please come back. Now, the reason you guys are here tonight, Charting the Land of Flowers, 500 Years of Florida Maps with Mr. Rodney Kite-Powell. He is the director of the Touchton Map Library at the Tampa Bay History Center. He's received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Florida and a Master of Arts from the University of South Florida, both in history. He wrote and lectured state and local history and is the author of 3 books, A History of Davis Island, David P. Davis, The Story of a Landmark Tampa Neighborhood, and Tampa Bay's Waterfront, Its History and Development. And again, I give to you Mr. Rodney Kite-Powell.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for coming out this evening. It's a real pleasure for me to come up here and share some of the maps that we have in our collection. Before I do anything, I gotta read something from the Florida Humanities Council because they are funding, I guess, most of my talk here. So I read something at the beginning and something at the end, and actually I think there's gonna be surveys for you guys to fill out. So here's the spiel from the beginning. This presentation today was funded by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida, Department of State, the Division of Arts and Culture, and the Council on Arts and Culture. As a nonprofit statewide partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Florida Humanities funds and coordinates public humanities programs and publications that explore the people, places, and ideas that shape the Sunshine State. Florida Humanities has awarded over $20 million in funding since its inception to help create and coordinate current and engaging humanities programming. Programs like these help promote and preserve Florida's diverse heritage and history, promotes civic engagement and community dialogue, and provides communities an opportunity to reflect on the future of the state. So that's that spiel. And I do want to do a little plug for the History Center in Tampa. We're located in downtown Tampa. And at the History Center, we have the Touchton Map Library. Tom Touchton and his wife Lavinia began collecting maps in the mid-1980s, and they have amassed an incredible collection. We are now the caretakers of that collection. It amounts to 6,000 or 7,000 maps, charts, atlases, other cartographic materials. And most of what you see in this presentation is from that collection. There are a couple items that are manuscript maps or charts that inherently there's only one copy of because it's a manuscript map or a hand-drawn map that are in institutions somewhere else in the world. But other than that, we have the maps. We also have a pirate exhibit that's in our permanent gallery. So I just peeked down at the pirate exhibit that you all have downstairs, and it's really great. And a little shout out for Jose Gaspar, Tampa's own pirate. But if you all find yourselves in Tampa, please come by the History Center and you can check out our pirates as well. So with that, let's talk about, what was that? Let's talk about some maps. Here we go. Charting the Land of Flowers. So in 2013, we put on a map exhibition, 150 maps that chronicled 500 years of Florida history as a way to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Ponce de Leon's arrival in and naming of Florida. And so that's what this program is based on. So the first map I'll show, and I feel like I'm in y'all's way. Let me get up here with Elvis. So the first few maps, or at least this first map, is not a map that we don't have in the collection. This is I just slipped my head. The Canton. It's a chart of the entire world, the known world, and you see very clearly, and I can even point it out to you, the very accurate depiction of Africa and Europe. And then you get over here. This is from 1503. And so once you get across the Atlantic, things get a little sketchy. They had a pretty good sense of what the northern part of South America looked like. They actually had a pretty good sense of Hispaniola, which is now Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then the island of Cuba, which was called Isabela. You also have this line, which was the line designated by the Pope as part of the Treaty of Tordesillas. And that was done because Portugal and Spain were arguing over who could have what on the other side of the Atlantic in the quote-unquote New World. And with a map like this, you think, wow, it's a pretty even distribution. Portugal gets everything on the east, and Spain gets everything on the west. You think, well, it's pretty even. Well, we know now it's not so even. But it also is why Brazilians speak Portuguese, because that was Portugal's possession, and that's pretty much all they got. But over here, and I think we zoom in, yes. Again, Hispaniola, Isabela, which is Cuba, and then this landmass here, and that looks like it could be Florida. Again, this is 1503, but it probably isn't Florida. When Columbus made his first voyages, of course, beginning in 1492, but he made 3 other voyages after that, including one of the people on the voyage was Ponce de Leon, I think his second or third voyage. He made all the people that were coming with him swear that they didn't find a quote-unquote new world, but they actually, in fact, had found the Far East. Because that was what his mission was. He wasn't looking for anything new. He was looking for old, just a faster way to get to it. And so the place names that are actually written on this map are Asian place names. And so it's likely that this isn't supposed to be Florida, but in fact supposed to be the Far East. And that's why also it goes kind of to the west, northwest of Cuba rather than being directly above Cuba. The fact that it's maybe not so accurate doesn't mean that it wasn't copied. And so from that one manuscript planisphere to this printed map by a man named Martin Valsemüller. He did this in 1513, and it basically is a copy of that earlier planisphere. And again, you can see right here, Hispaniola, Isabela, which is again a pretty accurate portrayal of Cuba, given the fact that it only had sailed around it for a few years. And then again, this thing over here, which they have attached to South America, but in fact is not Florida as much as we'd like for it to be Florida. It really isn't Florida. But again, this was printed in 1513. Again, 1513 was the year that Juan Ponce de Leon left Puerto Rico in search of the island of Bimini, which of course was what Florida is what he found. So 1513 is an important date. This map was printed in 1511 by a man named Peter Martyr. He wrote a history of the Caribbean, such as the Spaniards knew it. He was in the court of Spain. He was one of the advisors to the king. And he had a pretty thorough amount of information and a lot of access to information. And so in his book, he incorporated this map. And you can see the writing behind there. This is the page when you turn the page, the writing on the back actually describes the map on the front. And again, we'll point out we'll point out some things here. Hispaniola, and very clear. This is also now the first map to name Cuba, Isla de Cuba. And then you see here, it's written upside down for some reason, but it says Isla de Bimini, part of the island of Bimini. And you read the text on the back, it says, directly north of Cuba is a large landmass called Bimini by the natives. Bimini is what Ponce de Leon was looking for. This is printed 2 years prior to his voyage, though. So we know, we don't use the word discover, Ponce de Leon. One, because there are people that lived here for 12 or 15,000 years, but he also wasn't the first European to know about Florida. There likely were Spaniards who had made landfall in Florida prior to Ponce de Leon's arrival. Either slave raids or explorers or whatever reason would prompt people to go over there. So there was knowledge. And in fact, Ponce de Leon probably knew about this map. But the King of Spain didn't want anybody to know about this map because these kind of things were kind of state secrets. And particularly if the Portuguese or the English or the Dutch or somebody else found these things, then they know that there's more over there than they had previously thought. So the king had all the books that were printed recalled and this page torn out and destroyed. So there are only about 20 either whole books or pages that have this map on them in the whole world. And the History Center actually has one of them. There was a collector in Chicago who gave us his copy. And we were very fortunate because we never could afford to buy that copy. And so it's really, really important map, the Peter Martyr Map of 1511. So after Ponce de Leon's voyage, there were lots of maps that were made from it. And so one of them was this chart by Ferducci. And this is a portolan chart. And it's made from an animal skin, which is why it's shaped the way it is. This is the neck, either a sheep or a goat or something. And the inks on them are kind of indelible inks. And these portolan charts are almost always used on ships. They're very, very durable. They're basically waterproof. They won't, the inks won't run. And they're really incredibly accurate. And so if you look, when we zoom in on the Ferducci chart, you see the outline is something that looks a whole lot like Florida. And in fact, it's named Island of Florida, or Florida. And it has basically the extent of Ponce de Leon's voyage. Somewhere between modern-day St. Augustine and Melbourne is where he made it as far north on the east coast. He came all the way around to about or just south of Charlotte Harbor. This is the 1513 expedition. He came back in 1521 to actually try and colonize Florida. The kind of conventional wisdom is that he came back to Charlotte Harbor. There's actually a researcher in St. Petersburg who's making a pretty good case that he actually came as far north as the Tampa Bay area to do that. He just wrote a book about that. That's probably something that'd be good to come up here and lecture because he likes talking about that topic. Jim McDougall's his name. He's not a historian by trade, but he's done an incredible amount of research, and so it's kind of compelling. And we just don't know. If you look at all kinds of different, I'll show you some charts and maps of Florida from this time. Sometimes there's 2 bays, sometimes there's 3 or even 4 bays along the Gulf Coast of Florida. The names move up and down. Latitude is kind of hard to pin down this time given the navigational instruments that they had. So it's a lot of confusion about the geography of the west coast of Florida really until the early 1800s, and so we really don't know exactly where that effort was. Again, I'll point out Cuba. By this time, this is about 1518. The island of Cuba is very, very well mapped, and they're really accurate about not only its shape, but its size. This is a beautiful map that was part of Cortez's letters to the king in the 1520s. This is the very first map that shows the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico, first printed map that shows the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico. It's actually part of a larger map, and this part is not the important part for most people. The part that I cut off is the important part for most people. It's actually a beautiful map of Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, which is the capital of the Aztec Empire, no, excuse me, Maya Empire, and also the capital of Spain's possessions in the New World. It became New Spain. And so that was really what he was highlighting, but he also threw in the Gulf Coast as just this is also what we learned kind of thing. But for us, it's really important. And so it shows the Gulf Coast from Florida, including the Keys, going all the way around to the Yucatan, which for some reason they have as an island and not part of the peninsula, which is one of those things that happens a lot. It's confusing for some reason. If you figure they would sail all the way around, but this wasn't the information. The Yucatan Peninsula is often shown as an island. I'll show you pictures or maps of Florida that show Florida as an archipelago. Even California appears on maps as an island in this period, going all the way up to the late 1700s. So map making was still pretty hit and miss at this time. But this was a critically important piece of cartography because, again, it's the first map to show the entirety of the Gulf. Again, from 1524. This map was the result of another explorer, Hernando de Soto. So there are several explorers who came through Florida in the 1500s. Of course, I mentioned Ponce de Leon. I skipped over Narvaez, but Panfilo de Narvaez was an explorer who arrived in the Tampa Bay area in 1528, landed on the Pinellas Peninsula, and 4 members of his expedition that started out as a member of 400 made it across the country, basically, and to the Pacific coast of Mexico 8 years later. Incredibly difficult journey. And Narvaez was not one of them to have made that voyage. But a man named Cabeza de Vaca was, and he wrote a narrative about it. De Soto read that and thought, wow, this looks like a lot of fun. I'm going to go do the same thing. So in 1539, he also arrived in the Tampa Bay area, probably around the Manatee, Hillsborough County border at the south end of Tampa Bay, and started his expedition. The information gleaned from that expedition informed this map. And so you see lots and lots, of course they're very small, so I apologize, but lots of place names, mostly indigenous village names, but also a lot of rivers, and probably more than actually exist, at least to the scale that they show here, all emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. But all in all, given the map was made in the 1540s, a fairly accurate depiction of the Florida Peninsula and an oversized view of Tampa Bay. And this bay obviously clearly oversized. This is the Bay of Horses, and it's not nearly this big. But get a good sense of it. Cape Canaveral on the East Coast is one of the oldest landmarks and one of the oldest place names in Florida. And it's because of its prominence on the East Coast and because of the importance of the East Coast, really more so than Florida's West Coast, the Gulf Coast. You see lots of maps that show a very prominent Cape Canaveral. This is one of my favorite maps. This is a map of Florida by a Frenchman named Jacques Lemoyne that was then engraved by a German man named Theodore de Bry. So in 1564, a group of French Huguenots came to Florida to try and start a colony. And they created a place called Fort Caroline, somewhere around modern-day Jacksonville. Among the group of colonizers was this Jacques Lemoyne, who was an artist. And his job was to document the flora and the fauna in this new place and send the information back to people in France, because, of course, there was no other way to convey visual images. So everything was going great until the Spanish found out about this French Huguenot or Protestant settlement. And the King of Spain sent Pedro Menendez de Aviles to crush this outpost in Spanish Florida. Spain claimed basically all the United States at this point as Florida, not just the peninsula of Florida. They named the whole place Florida, the whole country. And so these Frenchmen, and again, worse Protestants, are trying to colonize and get a piece of Florida. So he sends Pedro Menendez here, and Pedro Menendez arrives in 1565 in September, establishes St. Augustine, which is the oldest continuously settled European settlement in the United States. And he goes about and crushes the French. Anybody know what the name of the river is that runs along St. Augustine? Anybody?
Matanzas.
The Matanzas, or Matanzas. Anybody know what Matanzas means in Spanish? It means massacre. And that's what he did to the French. He literally massacred them. They actually were French people who had surrendered at St. Augustine, and he killed them. Because, again, they were Catholic, so they weren't worth saving. And so Lemoyne survived. There were a fair number of survivors. He made it back to France. He died. His widow sold all of his papers. And then Theodore de Bry in 1591 engraved them. And so this is the map he created. It's not a very accurate map of Florida. It's not the right shape. Not even a very accurate map of the U.S., or what would become the U.S., because the coastline doesn't go shooting off to the east like this. Again, you see lots of little bays along here, and they were basically here. He didn't go anywhere else. He was here, so he didn't really see anything else. The information would have been gathered from other maps and other sources. Obviously, the Bahamas aren't this big. Cuba's outsized as well. But a great feature of this map is this guy right here, the sea monster. Sea monsters appeared on maps in the 1400s predominantly and early 1500s. But by 1591, you really didn't see a lot of sea monsters because a large part of their symbolism was either danger or fear or the unknown. But by this time, places like Florida were known. So it's very rare to find a map of Florida, or really many parts of what is now North America, and sea monsters. And so this is unique in that it has a map that really is focused on Florida. It's called the Map of Florida, with the sea monster on there. So in addition to what we think was a map that Lemoyne drew, but then DeBry embellished, there were lots of other images that Lemoyne drew. And again, one of my favorites is this one, which I have enlarged for your viewing pleasure. It depicts something that is an actual true event, but it's a bit fanciful. It is true that the native people, likely the Timucua for North Florida, did hunt alligators in this way. They didn't do it naked, though, because no one in their right mind is going to hunt alligator naked. But to Lemoyne and the other Europeans, they were naked because they were dressed from neck down to their feet. And so as a way to convey a certain amount of savagery and uncivility and a need for pacification and Christianization, he drew them naked. But if you're going to kill an alligator, particularly without any clothes on, this is the way to do it. You want to make sure they can't bite you. You want to turn them over so they can't hit you with the tail, because basically an alligator can really hurt you with its mouth or with its tail. And then once you turn them over, you can cut the belly because it's softer. You wouldn't beat them like this guy's about to, which is kind of weird. But again, there are some things that are accurate. Alligators are never this big. They didn't have ears. They don't have hands. But the native people, aside from having clothes, the men did have their hair, which was called a top knot. I think y'all have that kind of downstairs. And they would have these fish bladders they'd inflate and put in their ears as earrings and adornments. The one thing it doesn't show is any kind of tattooing, but that was also common among the Florida natives, tattooing and body painting. So there is some accuracy. The dwelling is completely inaccurate. It's like a south exhibit. This map is one of the first pirate maps or treasure maps that's ever been made. This dates from 1703. It's made by a man named Pierre Mortier, and he was a Frenchman who worked for the Dutch. And the Dutch were just at this time at war with the Spanish. It was called the War of the Spanish Succession. So one of the European wars, and really one of the first European wars to spill over into the New World. And so at this time, Spain's really only economy was the extraction of precious metals and minerals and things from the New World. Whether it was silver, gold, or emeralds, or whatever it was. That was the basis of their economy. So the way to beat the Spanish was to disrupt that economy. So what do? Is you have someone make a map that highlights the treasure routes for those ships as they come from Central America and the North America, the Mexican mines. All the ships are rallying in Havana and then going on their way up the east coast of Florida and across. So they take advantage of the Gulf Stream to get a little boost and they go across. So if you are a pirate or a privateer, hey, this is where you go to get the treasure. And this was pretty effective. There actually were a number of pirates and privateers who were active at this time on behalf of a lot of different countries and, of course, on their own behalf, who attempted to capture and successfully capture some of these Spanish treasure fleets. And if you didn't happen to read French, there's this down here that basically shows the treasure mines, the native and African-born laborers, slaves, working in the mines. The big treasure chest right here full of gold, which those things are kind of an anachronism, because if you fill a box that size with gold, nobody is going to move it. It's going to weigh hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Gold is incredibly heavy. So it's kind of silly, but even back then they kind of had treasure chests like that. And then they show this sea battle. So basically, if you want this, you got to do this. And this is where to do it on these treasure routes here. So I mentioned Florida and other places kind of being sometimes unknown about the geographical shape. And so this is a great example of the same map maker making two different maps at two different times, so, decades apart. There's a Frenchman named Nicolas Balagne, and he worked for the French Navy. He was a naval officer himself. And he was in charge, eventually, of all the nautical charts for the French government. And so you see two different maps. You see this map that shows Florida as a series of islands, kind of an archipelago, which looks obviously not very correct. But then you see here, Florida, that looks much more as we would think is familiar. So it's natural that this map is an improvement, or the newer version, and this is the first shot at it that he did, but he got wrong. But that would be incorrect. He did this one first, and then improved it, in his mind, to make it more accurate to do that. And it's a really weird thing, particularly because it happened at a very specific time, between the 1730s up to the 1770s. And this map was actually produced in 1749, so he kind of missed the beginning of it. And he was never here. Most of these people I'm talking about were never on this side of the Atlantic. They were just taking information from others, compiling it and making their own maps. And so he never sailed around the Gulf to get an idea of it. But the information going across prompted new maps to be made. And for whatever reason, particularly, it was spawned by the British, but there was this thought that Florida was a series of islands. And again, there's a map from the late 1730s. It was the first one that had it. It's actually a map of Georgia, but it did show Florida as an archipelago. But then it really kicked off in the 1760s and 1770s. And I have a theory that I'll share when we get to that point of our talk. So 1757. The Spanish were beginning to take more of an interest in the Gulf Coast of Florida, so they sent a naval officer named Francisco Maria Celli to Tampa Bay to actually chart Tampa Bay, the first person to actually come and do a proper mapping of the bay and the river. And so this is actually, a lot of these charts are kind of odd because they have north to the left and east is at the top. And that's kind of actually goes back to really early mapping where east was almost always at the top because that was where paradise was. And so they put that to the top of the map. But naval charts in the 18th century oftentimes have the same alignment. I honestly don't know why. But Celli came to Tampa, the Tampa Bay area in 1757 with a group of surveyors and mapped the whole bay. Tampa Bay, what we know as Tampa Bay, Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, the Pinellas Peninsula here, and then this is the Tampa Peninsula, South Tampa, MacDill Air Force Base is here. This is the Hillsborough River, downtown Tampa. And then this really interesting bit right here. All these trees, animals, and there's a turkey, there's a cow or a buffalo, and then there's two versions of this. There's one of them, I think this one has a native component as well. Celli was sent to Tampa Bay to look at the timber resources. Most of the islands in the Caribbean had been logged out, as had the old world forests in Europe, and so they're always looking for new sources of wood for shipbuilding and ship repair. And so that was one of his missions, was to find that. So that's why he drew so many trees, because he saw so many trees. Lots and lots of pines, cypress, and oak, all really good for making ships or repairing ships. So that's what he saw, and that's what he drew. So Spain likely would have come back to Tampa Bay and probably tried to set up a colony. There have been different attempts through the years to colonize Tampa Bay. Actually, Pedro Menendez, after kicking out the French, sent his son to Tampa Bay in 1566 to what is now Oldsmar to try and start a colony, but that failed. And there have been other attempts subsequent to that. And again, likely the Spanish would have done that if they hadn't lost or been participants in the loss of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. And that was from 1756 to 1763. In late 1762, the English captured Havana. Because the English were basically fighting the French, but Spain came in on the side of France to try and help France out. And so to retaliate, the English captured Havana. Spain really, really wanted Havana back. So the war ended the following year in 1763. So with the first Treaty of Paris, they're negotiating kind of who gets what, and Spain basically says, we really want Havana. So England said, what do you got? And what they got is Florida. And so Florida became a British colony, two, in fact. And we like to say, at least kind of south of the Canadian border, that we were the 14th and 15th British colonies, because in fact we were. The British split Florida up. East Florida is the peninsula, and West Florida is the panhandle. And this is a map right at the end of that war that shows the British colonies of North America and the seat of war, and that shows East Florida here cut off. The West Florida part is cut off. And so the British occupy Florida from 1763 to 1783. We stay loyal to the American Revolution, which is why no American history textbooks talk about Florida. You don't really hear much about Florida until the 1800s or even the 1900s. And part of it is because we were Spanish for so long, and the other part of it is because we were British and we stayed loyal, so we didn't get mentions in the American history books. But the British, during their 20-year period, were very interested in Florida. They did a lot of mapping. They actually had people come here and do mapping, not just from across the Atlantic, but it's also those guys who perpetuated this crazy idea of Florida as an archipelago. And there are lots of books that were published that related to Florida. It's my idea that because Florida was so big, and the one thing that the British had to offer were land grants to get people to come over and colonize in Florida, it's my sense that they wanted to focus that colonization in North Florida. So what better way to do that than produce maps that show an area that doesn't look so great here, but wow, look at this. It's connected to Georgia, connected to the rest of it over here, and you could really have, a nice plantation here. And it's the British who began to bring kind of what became an American-style plantation into Florida. I should mention that prior to this, when Spain controlled Florida, they actually actively encouraged enslaved people who were slaves in the British possessions, Georgia, South Carolina, what have you, to come into Florida, escape slavery, and convert to Catholicism. And if they did that, they were free. Because Spain did have slavery, but one of the rules is you could not enslave fellow Catholics. And so there were actually quite a few formerly enslaved people who escaped into Florida, converted to Catholicism, and became free. So many, in fact, that there was a whole town established north of St. Augustine called Fort Mose. And it's kind of recreated to some degree today. You can go visit it and see a lot of great artifacts that came from Fort Mose. But the British didn't have that. And so they brought kind of plantation-style slavery into Florida, which was perpetuated even more when it became an American possession. This is a wonderful map of Florida, not the most accurate map of Florida, but special for us, particularly at the History Center. It has, again, some pretty bad inaccuracies. There's several maps that show mountain ranges in Florida, and it is a little hillier up here than it is in my part of the world, but there's no mountains. And Tampa Bay or Bahia de Espiritu Santo is in the wrong place. There's some problems with it. But this is a really important map for us in Tampa because it was presented by a guy named William Stork to the first Earl of Hillsborough, the man for whom Hillsborough County was named. And it was kind of a gift. He was the mayor of London, but also he was a Secretary of State for the British colonies. So he's a really important guy, the kind of guy that someone like Stork would want to suck up to. And so he created this map and presented it to the first Earl of Hillsborough. Well, in the 1950s, the fifth Earl of Hillsborough visited Tampa for Gasparilla. And he brought this map with him, and he presented it back to Hillsborough County. And so we have that map. There are 2 copies of this map in the British Library, and then there's our copy. But ours is the only one that's a presentation copy to the Earl of Hillsborough. So it's special for us, even though it's not the best map. This is the 1770s, early 1770s, a very skilled map maker named Thomas Jeffries came to Tampa Bay, and he did what Selly did in 20 years prior, even copying, say, Tampa Bay according to the Spaniards. This was Selly's version of what was then called Tampa Bay. This was called Espiritu Santo. This was named Hillsborough Bay in honor of the Earl of Hillsborough. Eventually, this became Old Tampa Bay, and this became just called Tampa Bay. But it's a very accurate map, much more accurate than even the Selly map, showing the Pinellas Peninsula, again, north over here to the left. The Inner Bay Peninsula of Tampa doesn't look quite like this, doesn't have these little appendages here. At least we don't think so. Obviously, the land does change through hurricanes and different things, so don't think it looked like this exactly, but it's pretty close. So, again, fast forwarding a bit. The British lose the American Revolution, and they lose Florida. Spain gets Florida back in 1783, and they possess Florida until 1821. The Adams-O'Neese Treaty finalizes the transfer of Florida from Spain to the U.S. It actually took 2 years, almost 3 years, beginning in 1819, but there was a lot of kind of turmoil in Spain, so it took a while for the treaty to be ratified, and then it was ratified by our Congress, and so Florida became a U.S. territory. This is an early territorial map of Florida, showing a few counties. Most of the counties were in North Florida, because that's where most of the white population was. Again, this was kind of the beginnings of a plantation economy here as well. In 1823, there was the first of a series of treaties with the Seminoles, who are now part of Florida's history. They began arriving in the 1700s, and so they were encouraged by the Spanish and kind of encouraged by the English. When the Americans arrived, they felt, okay, we can just deal with the Seminoles for a while. So they at first created a large reservation in the middle of the territory, and they also called for the establishment of a series of forts around that. And so that's where a lot of the forts come from that are here. And then, of course, subsequently in the Seminole Wars, which we'll talk about in just a second. The Seminole Wars, as you know, started, the Second Seminole War, I should say, with the Dade Battle, or what was originally called the Dade Massacre. Colonel Dade and 104 men coming from Fort Brooke in Tampa up to Fort King in Ocala. They attacked by a group of Seminoles. All but one were killed. There were a couple survivors, but two of those three died. So really only one true survivor, a guy named Ransom Clark. The map makers figured and heard that there was going to be a county named after Dade in 1835 or 1836, and so they jumped the gun and they actually put Dade County here, which is where Pinellas and a little bit of and Pasco is. There's a little bit of Hillsborough. They actually got Hillsborough County wrong too. Hillsborough was all of this. But again, they kind of messed up a little bit. No one would have thought that they'd make a county down here and call it Dade, so that's why they popped it up there. And then this was copied actually by a few different map makers, and they put Dade County in the wrong place. So unfortunately, that's really blown out. I apologize. But these two maps both date from the Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War, and you all know a lot about that because there's a lot of Seminole War history tied up to this part of Florida. But it was the longest and costliest of all the Indian wars that the U.S. government ever fought. But from a mapping standpoint, it's an interesting war as well. And this map in particular is really telling. And there was a quote by one of the across towns, rivers, Indian villages, whatever it is, write them on the map. Once you have a few of them, send them back to us in Washington, and we will issue new maps with your information. So if you heard the term crowdsourcing in modern times, that's what this was. They were trying to get the Army officers who were actively in the field to start filling out the map of Florida because there was really not much that was known, and it was really effective. And so there were several maps that were printed subsequent to that had a lot more information about the interior of Florida. So another war map for another war. Of course, Florida left the Union in 1861, joining the Confederacy at the beginning of the Civil War, just prior to the beginning of the Civil War. By July of 1861, the Federal Navy had pretty much entirely blockaded the Florida coastline. And that was a really important effort, that northern blockade, what they called the Gulf Blockading Squadron, because of there's so much coastline. Florida really provided a huge vulnerability for the North's efforts to try and stem any kind of trade coming into the South, and a great opportunity for the Confederacy to do just that, to bring in arms and ammunition, to send out cotton, and really bring in supplies, because you've got this huge shoreline. So this map is drawn by a guy named John Bachman to show what Florida looked like. And really, he did one for every southern state, every Confederate state. And you can actually lay them out and see kind of the South in this really interesting bird's eye view format. And again, of course, he had no way to actually see Florida this way, because they didn't even have they had the very beginnings of hot air balloons toward the middle of the war. This is the beginning of the war, to go up, and he never could get this high anyway. Certainly no satellites or airplanes. So this is purely his own artistic eye being able to see Florida from this perspective. And I've always kind of imagined him looking at a globe and maybe getting the perspective from that way. But however he did it, it's an incredibly accurate map. If you look at it up close, and I should say, and I'll mention it at the end, all of these maps that are in our collection, you can go on our website and you can look at them and you can zoom in them really well. They're really high resolution maps. So you can zoom in on this map in particular really well. And you'll see all of the Seminole War era forts that existed in Florida. They're all indicated on here with a little building and a little flagpole. And the flagpole is empty because they're occupied by Confederate forces or Confederate leaning forces, with a couple of exceptions. One of them being Key West, because Key West was always occupied by the Federal Navy, so it never went into Confederate hands. And there's a fort somewhere in the Everglades that hadn't been taken over either, so it has little American flags. Every other fort has a bare flagpole, an empty flagpole, because it's held by the Confederates. It's really an amazing view. And also you can show a little bit of the rudimentary railroad network that existed in Florida at the time, particularly the Jacksonville to Fernandina Railroad, and the beginnings of the railroad that would go from Fernandina and Jacksonville to Cedar Key, and then the one from Fernandina that would eventually make it all the way across to Tallahassee and then to Pensacola, but that wasn't until after the end of the war. And so after the end of the war, Florida was in terrible shape, kind of losing population, losing money. The government itself was basically broke, didn't have anything going for it except the ownership of an incredible amount of land. And so the state was able to start leveraging that land in a variety of different ways. One of the things they did is if you created a canal, you wanted to have a canal that would go across the peninsula, the state would fund the survey for that canal. Now, doing a survey for a canal and doing a survey for a railroad are basically the same thing. And so railroad companies would say, we want to do a canal, and you're going to pay for the survey. And they'd say, well, you know what, the survey shows it'd be better to do a railroad, so we'll do a railroad instead, save the survey done for free. But there were attempts at different times of actually having canals go across the Florida Peninsula, beginning far earlier than this. This is from the 1888. There were attempts in the early 1800s and all the way up to the early 1960s to cross Florida through different kind of canals. But this is one of those efforts either to do a canal or a railroad. But the biggest thing for Florida was the Hamilton-Diston land sale, 4 million acres of land for $1 million. And it was really it was a way for Florida to become solvent, basically, and have some money to do some things. And Hamilton-Diston bought 4 million acres of land. Most of it here in the interior of Florida, but he did buy the end of the Pinellas Peninsula, a place that's now called Gulfport, was briefly called Diston City. But he bought a huge amount of land. Eventually he killed himself, and I don't think it's because of the land deal, but it didn't help because he really wasn't able to do much with the land. But eventually, Florida was able to parlay that $1 million into a lot of other things. Again, particularly being able to entice true railroad people to come in, and two of those that we all know are Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. They're the ones who really brought prosperity into Florida by bringing the railroads into Florida. But one of the things, particularly through Plant's railroad, that was important, in addition to, of course, passenger traffic, was freight. And so this is where this map comes into play. The discovery of phosphate in Florida was really, really important to the west coast of Florida, but in particular Tampa and then Punta Rassa, the Boca Grande area, because that's where the majority of the phosphate was shipped out. And so you would have railroads that would be in the mines of Florida, either going to the port here, either a port of Tampa or Port Tampa down here, or again to Punta Rassa, where they had a very big phosphate operation. And shipping out phosphate became huge, huge business. Again, not nearly as much as the railroads themselves. So here's two maps. The map on the left is the Plant system. The map on the right is the East Coast Railroad or the Flagler system. The thing I love about the railroad maps is if you look at one, you would think that there isn't even another system in the state. You think, well, of course, Plant has all this, but what's going on? There's nothing really over here. And you look at this like, well, of course, Flagler has all this, but there's really no railroads over here. Because, of course, they highlight their own systems. They do have thin black lines for the other guy. Allegedly, they invested in each other's railroads and they were friends, but they did have this rivalry going on between the two. Plant's network was much more extensive. Flagler's was much more single-minded, right down the East Coast to Miami, and then eventually in 1912 down to Key West. They both had, of course, hotels that went along with that. The luxury northern guest was the main target, who would come here during the winters, would spend generally all winter in Florida, arriving sometime December, January, depending on the weather, both here and up north, and would stay through March or April in these luxurious hotels. And both systems would publish maps that highlight the hotels and all the other amenities that come with it, and show their connections to the Caribbean, in this case, all the way down to Mexico, Jamaica, Havana, Cuba here, and the same with the Flagler system. Again, unfortunately, a little washed out, but this is a map of Miami Beach before it was Miami Beach, when it was supposed to be a place called Ocean Beach, Florida. A different developer, not Carl Graham Fisher, but the Bindle and Anderson Company, prior to World War I, wanted to develop the barrier islands in Miami, but they didn't succeed. But Carl Graham Fisher bought those islands just prior to World War I, but after the war was able to begin developing and dredging and creating what we know as Miami Beach, and really sparking the Florida land boom in the 1920s. Which created whole cities, places like Boca Raton and others, and then whole developments within existing cities like Davis Islands and Tampa and many, many others, but also creating places that never really took off and became kind of ghost towns at the end of it all. But it was a huge shift of people from the North and the Midwest into Florida trying to buy land. It was all based on land speculation that eventually, because of the fervor of it, eventually collapsed. This is Davis Islands in Tampa, based on basically Miami Beach, what Carl Graham Fisher did there. David P. Davis was actually from Green Cove Springs, grew up in Tampa. During the war, World War I, he lived in Jacksonville, but right after the war, he went to Miami, sold real estate, saw what Fisher did down there, and remembered these little kind of delta islands in Hillsborough Bay at the end of the Hillsborough River, and dredged them to create Davis Islands. And so he made millions of dollars and eventually killed himself while on the way to Europe. It's an interesting story, which I can get into later. This is the 1940s. By this time, Key West, which was at one time the largest city in Florida in the late 1900s, was becoming more of a tourist destination. And so this is a really incredible map, a pretty rare version of this map, the hand-colored version that shows Kiowasso or Key West. In Key West history is interesting. We actually have an exhibit now at the History Center on the history of Key West. The islands originally had the name the Martyrs, again, allegedly because they looked like martyrs or martyred people being martyred if you looked at them from a distance. But the idea really is likely Ponce de Leon named them that because that was on the Peter Martyr map. He named them the Martyrs because he's recognizing Peter Martyr's efforts in making that map that he used to find Florida. And that's what you see in the Martyr map of the Keys. Eventually they became Kiowasso, or Bone Key, because, again, allegedly some Spanish people saw a bunch of bones on the beach of Key West. And then Hueso became Oeste, which is west, so Kiowasso, Key West. And so then you have the anglicized version of it being Key West. Again, by this time in the 1940s, again, it was becoming very much a tourist destination. The last couple shots I have are of Florida from space. This is the very first photograph of Florida taken from space. John Glenn took this photograph when he went up in, I think it was 1967, I think. And I include this picture in particular because think back to the map that showed Florida as an archipelago, all the different islands. Well, this is the 1960s. There have been 60 years of drainage projects that have been taking place in the Everglades. Beginning in the early 1900s, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, when he was governor, authorized basically the draining of the Everglades. The creation of canals and things for agriculture down there. So there had been 60 years of work to make Florida less wet. And still, look at all the lakes and everything here. And for our own perspective, you think, wow, that looks much more islandy than you ever would have thought. Now throw in the fact that the Everglades had more water in them prior to the early 1900s, and throw in the fact that we don't know exactly what weather patterns were in the 1700s. So those maps that we see as so inaccurate, maybe they actually were accurate. We just don't know. But this shot really kind of gives us another opportunity to rethink what Florida might have looked like at that time. And then I end with this, and this actually needs updated. This is a photograph of Florida from the space station. And you all are about as central Florida, far away from the coast as you can get. You can maybe Orlando, maybe a little more distant from the coast. But most people in Florida live within 20 or 30 miles of the coast. And that's what this map certainly shows. Highlights where people live, by the lights being on. And I joke that this map is old because it doesn't show the villages. They would be there. But also, the lights would be turned off anyway because it'd be nighttime, so you wouldn't see the villages anyway. But I need to get a new one because I suspect you would see a little more of the villages in there. But you do see Jacksonville, Orlando, Lakeland, of course, Tampa Bay area, the Fort Myers, Naples area, and all of South Florida, totally illuminated. But then a whole lot of dark, and that's what Florida is. And it shows our vulnerabilities to the coastline, weather, rising waters, all those different things, to show that we haven't changed a whole lot because the mapping and everything started off on the coast and we still live on the coast. So with that, that's the end of my talk. Thank you all. I got to do my little spiel at the end, and then I'll be happy, if there are any questions, to take questions. But let me do my little closing bit here for the Humanities Council. Thank you for your time and attention. Oh, sorry. Oh, this. Oh, yeah, this will stay. So thank you for your time and attention. This presentation today was funded by Florida Humanities and is sponsored in part by the State of Florida, Department of State, the Division of Arts and Culture, and the Council on Arts and Culture. Florida Humanities appreciates feedback about your experience today. I will say only if it's good, though, so don't, follow the link on the screen. Not that link. That link. On the screen, where'd I go? Or complete a survey card, which may or may not be out here, with your thoughts about the program. For the latest information and to find other events near you, we encourage you to sign up for Florida Humanities newsletters, and that is a good idea. So with that, if there are any questions, I can make up answers all night. So what do you got?
Interested in maps about previous canals. First, historically we hear references to the Spanish-run canals, the English-run canals. Have you encountered any maps of proposed canals?
So there are lots of maps of proposed canals, but most of them are American. And so I suspect the Spanish and English maps would either be manuscript maps, so they would be, with whether it was the navies or whatever the government offices, or they could be printed maps. Maybe they make a whole lot of them. I don't think we have any pre-American canal maps. The earliest map that shows an attempt at making a canal is an 1829 map by a guy named Swift. And he was an Army officer and West Point grad engineer. And his map is actually beautiful and it's enormous. And he shows, I think, about 10 different coastal cities and port towns where you could start and end the canal. And he also showed the different rivers that you could connect. Because the idea of it was to find a way to make the least amount of work. So what rivers work? So the St. Mary's River was one of the ones, of course, the St. John's is one, the Apalachicola was one. They tried to make, Hillsborough was even one, make these different connections across Florida, connecting the different rivers. And so Swift's, as far as I know, is the first one that we have in the collection. But there's no doubt that the Spanish and English created maps that did that, but I don't know of them because they're not in our collection. But there's just going to plug for some other institutions. Of course, the Library of Congress has an incredible map collection. There's a great collection in California that's owned by Stanford University, the Rumsey Collection. The British Library has a beautiful collection, and the Museo Naval in Madrid has an incredible collection, and the Archive of the Indies in Sevilla in Spain. They also have great map collections that all relate directly to Florida. One thing that we know exists, but we don't know exactly what is in it, is, of course, the National Archive of Cuba in Havana. Havana was, along with Mexico City, really one of the two major capitals of Spanish influence in the New World. But since Castro took over, there's not a lot of access, even all these years later, to those archives. There are some researchers who've been able to poke around, but a lot of them haven't really been focused on the map side of things. And so kind of one of my kind of dreams would be to be able to go and spend a good bit of time in Havana having access to those maps. But I don't know if I'll ever do that. Any other Questions? Yes, sir.
How do you store and preserve maps?
It's a great question. How do you store and preserve maps? First, you get a lot of money because you need to have that. And so it costs a lot. You know, we think about the care and feeding of a collection. It's really can be very expensive. And so we are very fortunate that that the Touchtons, in addition to giving us the map collection, have endowed funding for us to preserve that collection. And so we have custom-made flat files for the largest maps, 8 feet wide drawers for the largest charts. We have compact storage units for other maps that have flat files in them, and so we were able to store. We probably could store 30 or 40,000 maps, so we have some room to grow, which is great. We acquire about a dozen maps a month, believe it or not. Mostly 20th century now, because that's what the market has. But every now and then we'll acquire something old. We actually just acquired, and I can't really do much with the presentation because the Humanities Council wants me to do it a certain way, the way I created it. But we just acquired a great view, again, one of about 20 that exists in the world, of St. Augustine from Sir Francis Drake's raid of St. Augustine from 1586. It's an incredibly rare view. And there's speculation about it. I looked downstairs and there wasn't an image of it, but there are 2 different versions of that view of St. Augustine. One of them you see more often because it just looks better. It has color, there's a really neat dolphin in the corner, and it's the view of Drake's raid that people see most. But the one that we acquired is likely the first state of that. It actually has some errors on it that were likely updated to create that second, more attractive state, including the compass rose pointing the wrong direction, and some missing information in the descriptions of what's on the map. And so either way, there's only, again, about 20 or so of either one of those that exists in the world. And so we just acquired that last year. And so we're going to put that in our own pirate show, because basically Drake was a privateer who didn't capture, but he burned not only St. Augustine, but other Spanish possessions as part of that voyage in 1586. And so we do acquire old, but most of the stuff that we require is newer. But yeah, if something comes in, we store it in Mylar. We don't ever encapsulate it by sealing it all the way around because that's not the best practice. We want to be able to open it and open the Mylar and take it out if need be. We do have some money for conservation if a map comes in that's really severely damaged. But we try and not buy things that are in really rough shape unless it's something that is really one of a kind kind of thing. But yeah.
Can you tell us how the Touchtons began collecting maps?
I can. Very short version of the story. If Tom was here, he'd give you the full story. But basically, he and his wife, Lavinia, were in London, I believe it was 1984, for her 40th birthday. And they wanted to commemorate it somehow. And so they were at a book fair. Tom actually collected books at that time. And they saw a guy who had a little booth selling maps. His parents sold maps through Harrods, the department store in London. And so he was sitting there. No one was really, buying anything from him. So they chatted with him a bit. And Tom said, oh, who collects maps? And so the guy talked a little bit about it. And so he took some information from him. And it turns out the hotel they were staying in was right across the street from a guy named Jonathan Potter, who was a map dealer. So the next morning, Tom went over to talk to Jonathan. And he walked in and says, I want to start collecting maps. And Jonathan said, okay, what do you want to collect? There's a lot of maps you can collect. And so Tom hadn't really thought about it, but he said, well, my wife and I are both from Florida. Our families go back a long time in Florida, particularly Lee's side. We'll collect Florida maps. And that kind of just whim of we'll collect Florida maps started this whole thing. The very first map they bought, though, was a map of Canterbury. And so he numbered his maps with the letter M, and then sequentially how he bought them. So M1 is a map of Canterbury. But an M2 is actually a Shadle's view of the known world prior to Columbus's voyage. It's dated 1494, but the information hadn't gotten back yet. So it's kind of the last map that shows just the old world. But M3 is a Florida map, and going all the way forward are Florida maps. And they've collected maps. Lee passed away about a year and a half ago, but Tom still helps us collect to this day. Yeah.
I remember mentioning you wrote that map exhibition at the Historic
Mm-hmm.
Center.
Oh.
I remember what
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago, that probably down in Rankin, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested, what was downtown Tampa was actually, they showed a lot of Indian mounds, and what was extensive settlement.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my question would be, did they capture, is there any record of the native settlements across one?
Well, archaeologically, there absolutely is. So the best kind of way to see that is a little plug for my alma mater, University of Florida. The Florida Museum of Natural History on campus there really chronicles the native history of Florida really well. I think they just actually de-installed their North Florida gallery. They're going to do some work with that. But they have a beautiful South Florida gallery, talks about the Calusa, talks about the Seminoles. So there's been incredible work archaeologically done. And there's a series of UF archaeologists, Dr. Milanich, Dr. Marquardt, Dr. Deegan, lots of archaeologists have done a lot of work in Florida. And so there also has been, kind of amateur work done in Florida too, which was somewhat beneficial but also very detrimental because you're digging into these mounds, kind of haphazardly looking for things, and so you destroy the context a lot. And there actually is a great story. In the 1920s, kind of part of the land boom, there was a guy who owned pretty much all of Weeden Island in St. Petersburg. And what he wanted to do is trying to make a name for Weeden Island, so he planted a bunch of what he thought would be really neat Indian artifacts in the ground, and he called it Smithsonian, and had them come down and see it. And so very quickly they thought, well, this is just garbage this guy buried, but we're here, let's look around. And they actually discovered what became known as the Weeden Island pottery pattern. And so there's actually more Weeden Island pottery north of Weeden Island, kind of in the Cedar Keys area than there is in Weeden Island. But they found it in Weeden Island first, which is why it's called Weeden Island pottery. So that scam kind of turned into this really great discovery. But it's all done archaeologically. So in Tampa, there was a mound right in downtown Tampa, about where the hockey arena is. And it stood for thousands of years. There actually was a doctor at Fort Brooke in the 1870s who poked around and found human remains. And they are still with the Smithsonian. They've not been repatriated. But in the 1880s, when the fort was decommissioned and the city was beginning to grow, the city leaders realized that they had this great material they could use to fill what they called the Jackson Street Ditch. There was a creek that ran along one of the streets in Tampa going to the Hillsborough River. So they basically moved this mound that had human remains in it and dumped it in this creek bed to create solid ground to fill the Jackson Street Ditch. And so that's another legacy we have of some of the archaeology as well. Yes?
I found it interesting when you were talking about how, when you look at maps, sometimes the orientation is not exactly north. Well, I remember them talking about when some grad students were here from the West in the early 80s, and they had a map. They were looking for Osceola Palestine.
Oh, yeah.
And in the process, of course, they found what is today called Haven now, and that ended up being even more significant because there's like 3 periods of occupation there. The Native Americans, the Spanish community, and then the Seminole. But they had found that, I don't know if it's still alive or not, but they found this map of this area in that time period in a cabin up in New Jersey. And so the archaeologists used the map in trying to locate it, but basically they were looking at it in verse, and they were looking for Palestine on the other side of the river. And then when they figured out it needed to be flipped, then they started looking up on this side of the river, and then they kind of found what they were looking at.
Yeah, and that, sometimes the way either the printing process or the reproduction process, you'll have a reverse. And so not necessarily like a photograph, but that's the idea, like a photo negative. And so the Library of Congress, the National Archives has several maps of Fort Brooke, but they are reversed, and some of them actually are kind of negatives. They're the way they printed them. So the outline is white and everything else is black. But there are others that are truly reversed. There's no writing on them, so you wouldn't know unless you knew the geography because of the reproduction process. So that's interesting. That
They originally got it turned by them, and then they did find things over here on the west side.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. Yes.
You had a map about when they found phosphates and everything.
Mm-hmm. That was 1888, that map in particular, but it was the 1880s is when the search for phosphate started. So again, Florida had land. That was pretty much all we had to offer anybody, and the resources that were within that land. So whether it was agricultural land or extractive resources, there's no gold and silver, there's no naturally occurring metal in Florida, but the rock, the phosphate rock, could be really valuable. And so those phosphate discoveries, first in rivers and then later in the ground, kind of adjacent to rivers, was a huge discovery. And actually that map showed two different types of phosphate, hard rock and soft pebble phosphate, which determines how you're going to mine it and those different things. And it's, I guess, even its content and use in fertilizer. And that's what phosphate's used for, mainly as fertilizer. Yes, sir.
Given the extensive and valuable materials that the Tampa Bay History Center has in the building, do you consider it all, or when they produce it for a large store, very down on Tampa, what would you do with the collections of
Yeah. So I'm glad, that's a great question. So what, if you didn't hear, the History Center is located in downtown Tampa. We're on the water. So what do we do when the big one comes? And that is going to happen. There's actually, we've been very, very lucky, knock on wood. There have been a few storms that have diverged at the last minute, but it's going to happen. We're going to have a storm. And so when we built the History Center on the Garrison Channel on Hillsborough Bay, the building is not hurricane-proof. Nothing's hurricane-proof, but it is as hurricane-resistant as you can make a building. If y'all have been there, you'll know when you walk up to the building itself, we have a parking garage on the ground floor, and there's we have like a workshop and some other stuff. But basically, you got to go up to the second floor before you encounter any exhibits or any artifacts or anything like that, and that's about 25 feet above sea level. So kind of the worst case scenario, even storm surge and that kind of stuff is not going to get that high. Our collection storage is on the third floor, so it's about 50 feet above sea level. It's in the center of the building, no exterior walls, and there's a whole floor above that. And so that collection space is about the safest place you can be. If you got to be on the coast, it's just where you want to be. And so in the event of the big one coming, we've identified the artifacts that would be damaged if something happened, so they would come out of the galleries and they would go into collection storage. We have a generator that has 3 days worth of diesel fuel, and so 3 days isn't very much in the event of a really big disaster, but at least it gets you something. So we have the air conditioning would stay on for the artifacts as well. So and then hopefully we'd be able to get diesel refueling within 3 or 4 days, because the place is pretty well insulated, so we could go a day or so without air conditioning, without really stuff being in bad shape. But it's a problem. And we have an atrium that's all glass, but it's actually the kind of coastal grade or level is 140 mile per hour impact resistant double pane glass. And we actually had a very small, because Florida doesn't have big tornadoes, but we actually had a water spout come on land and become a tornado and hit the building. When I was actually in the atrium when that happened. And so it was like, I'd never been in a tornado before because I'm a Floridian. But it was as if the building went through a car wash. It was the craziest thing. And then pieces of buildings from around were blowing past us, and the Columbia restaurant, the old Spanish restaurant, has a cafe in our place, and all their stuff blew away that was outside. But the building itself was fine. And so it was a very minor test, but at least it was a little bit of a test. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, to what extent was the mapping your either professional journey or in the archives, as you start seeing more maps of the interior of Florida, do you start also seeing notations about wildlife? And you showed a map about sea monsters, I would say exaggerated optics of the interior. But if we're looking at 13 and 14 footer alligators nowadays, I would be surprised if you saw that long ago.
Yeah.
But are there any, say, wildlife focus?
So again, the Selly map of Tampa Bay showed animals, and so it showed turkeys and either a buffalo or a cow, because there were wild cows in Florida by that time that the Spanish had let go, pigs and things like that. Those kind of illustrated maps, though, weren't that common at that time. So you would need to have what's called an illustrated map, a map that has these illustrations on them that would indicate those kinds of things. And so you don't really see illustrated maps until the 18th and 19th centuries, or early 19th and early 20th centuries. And by that time, we kind of knew all the things that were in Florida. So where you're going to find that information more so would be in, like Bartram, the son and father each wrote about Florida and in his travels, their travels through Florida. Prior to that, there was a guy named Mark Catesby who was in North Florida, and he went, through South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina, but he also came into North Florida, and he wrote about his experiences in Florida. And then other travelers who came through in the 19th century, they wrote documents they documented those kinds of things as well. Oftentimes they didn't show up on their maps, although again, the map that's the front piece of, I forget which Bartram's book, does show, I think, a bear and a stork or something like that. So they do show up as artistic pieces as part of maps, but not really representing all the flora and fauna that are in the state. Again, you don't see those illustrated maps really until the 1870s, 1880s, and really they pick up in the 19 teens and 20s. Yes?
You talked about the port of
Punta Rasa.
Where would that be?
It's in Boca Grande. So Boca Grande, yeah, down there, like Gasparilla Island. And so in the 1850s, there were cattle shipments from Tampa to Cuba. Some of the very first international trade, basically, were these cattlemen who gathered all their cattle, sent them to Tampa, and then put them on ships, then went to Cuba. But there was a really bad drought in 1859, and a lot of the cattle died. So beginning in 1860, it didn't last very long because of the Civil War, but 1860, the cattlemen then went down to Punta Rasa, where there was deep water in the Charlotte Harbor area, kind of Gasparilla Island, and they began shipping down there. So again, you get the Civil War interrupt things, but when the Civil War is over and they began shipping phosphate, people remembered, oh yeah, Punta Rasa was a great place to ship things, and so they opened up a great kind of very big phosphate processing area on the south end of Gasparilla Island. Big Gasparilla Island, not Little Gasparilla. Yes, sir.
And follow on everybody's response. You said that you have a lot of stuff online.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of the collection is digitized?
So the map collection, I'd say about 98% is digitized. Our overall collection, we have about 100,000 items in the museum's overall collection, and unfortunately, only about 20% is digitized. That's something we're going to start really doing in earnest in the next probably 5 to 6 years. We've just received 2 huge image collections. One, a collection of Florida postcards, amounts to about 7,000 postcards, and then another is a photograph collection just of the Tampa Bay area, but aerial photographs, and there's somewhere between 60 and 80,000 photographs, mostly slides, that are from the 1960s to the 1990s. And they're it's an incredible time period of growth in in the area, so they're a great resource. But they need to be digitized to actually be used. And then, of course, the 3D collection, the actual objects, that's something we want to do as well. And so we're actually just making beginning the stages of making our switch of our collections management software, not to get too far in the weeds. That'll be a different software that will allow us to have those things online in a much better way. So that's kind of the goal. Right now we use a platform called Luna, which is where you see the maps if you go on our website. But ultimately it'll be on a different platform. It shouldn't be much different for the public, but it'd be much better for us. Any other? Yes. Oh, absolutely, yeah. There we go. So TampaBayHistoryCenter.org is our website. If you go there, you can go, I think the Touchton Map Library has a tab. If not, it's in the exhibits side of things. And if you look at the maps, the one thing you can't do as of now is download anything. And the reason for that is we have the whole collection available online. But after 1922, the maps from that period forward are still under copyright of the original copyright holder or whoever a subsequent holder is. And so we didn't want to violate that copyright by allowing copies of those maps to be released. But if you see any maps that could be helpful for your life, you could order copies of anything printed prior to 1922, and we can give those to you. If you're doing scholarly research, we'll supply it to you for free. If you want one for your home or office wall, it's a very minimal price. You can have a reproduction made. So that's that. And please come to Tampa. It's only an hour and a half away. Yeah, oh yes. What? Last word. Yes. Yep, big drag lines, yep. Mm-hmm. So there are, the best maps to do as comparisons are the state soil maps. The state in the early 1900s produced soil maps for every county. And so you can look at those, and they not only show the soil types, they show the topography. And so you can compare that with the topographical map today and see the differences based on that. There probably are phosphate maps, but we have some phosphate maps, but mostly Polk and Manatee are the phosphate maps that we have. So we don't think we have anything of citrus, but we might. And you can do, the website, the maps are searchable, but the descriptions are kind of rudimentary. We want to get as much up as possible, so be a little more basic with your search terms. Don't be very specific, because you probably won't find what you're looking for. But if you're basic county, city, things like that region, you have a good chance of finding stuff. So if there's no more questions, I want to thank you all once again. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.